we start, I'll just do a quick roll call just to check if all the judges are here. So, Jean, are you on the call?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, beautiful. Super Nana, I saw you. Alhassan?
I'm here.
Abdul-Lateef?
I'm here.
Yamikani? The speaking order for Zimbabwe BC, Barry will be speaking first proposition, Kudakwashe will be speaking second proposition, Elvis Machia will be speaking third proposition, and Barry will be taking the proposition reply. In opposition, we have Brian Lufuno as first opposition, Loyiso Mabena as second opposition, Matida Macheka as third opposition, and Loyiso Mabena will be taking the reply speaker for the team in opposition. The motion for tonight's debate is, with the benefit of hindsight, this House believes that we should have abolished NATO after the fall of USSR. Before we start, Joseph, are we ready with the live stream? Okay, live stream is ready. Dean, I'm going to hand over the debate to you. If Yami is not here, we can just proceed.
Okay. First, before we begin, I'd like to say congratulations for everyone that's made it this far. This is an incredibly hard tournament to rank at, and so to see yourself at the final is a phenomenal achievement, and you should be incredibly proud of yourselves. I think we've already introduced ourselves as judges, but I, as chair, as Dean Femayi, I'll be like with my panelists today, trying to judge you for this auspicious final. So before we get into that, please refer to the panel as a whole. So just refer to us as panel. And first proposition, you can be free to declare your pronouns as well as your POI preference. Please do keep your cameras on if possible, and as well as, the formal attire. That way we're able to be, just to treat it as a final. So you have every reason to be proud. Without further ado, would now like to call upon the first speaker on the proposition side. Here.
Am I both visible and audible? But yeah. Am I both visible and audible? Am I both visible and audible? Please do confirm.
Yes to both. Yes to both.
All right. So with that said and done, hi guys, Barry here. This has been a very interesting tournament. So just key shout outs before I begin. As always, thank you to my teammates, Elvis, Kuda. You guys have been carrying me the entire tournament. I could have not won this without you, literally. There was so many instances I thought we were gonna lose this. But anyway, with all of the excitement gone, let's have a fun debate and let's enjoy it. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. NATO should have ended after the Cold War. Its enemy, the USSR, existed for so long. In all instances, we believe that in any time in which we have the NATO, it fails us to protect us. It's a puppeteer for the USA to exploit the vast majority of the people. It stands to make these particular organizations irrelevant or very proud to propose today. I think there'll be a few key things that you can note from my speech. One, clear setup about where this debate actually lies in. Two, argumentation, and then furthermore, just going to give you comparatives as to why we think argumentation realistically matters. Onto the setup then. I think key elements that we ought to recognize is the actual framing here. I think first key thing then is America, because this person plays a huge part. We refer to it as a person because it refers to Donald Trump, the main actor in this particular instance. What's often going to occur with this thing, it provides some form of empty threats and
Okay, it seems one of the speakers has cut out. We'll wait for him to rejoin. If it's also possible for the teammates to also just contact him on our behalf, that would be great. Thank you.
Maybe that's the issue. Yeah.
Hi, Barry.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Yes, we can hear you. You cut out. Do you want to know where you were? So you can continue from there. You could also just really restart since it's 54 seconds in.
Oh yeah, 54 seconds. I'm just gonna start again. Sorry. All right, I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. NATO should have ended after the Cold War. Its main enemy, the USSR, was gone, but instead of stepping back, it kept growing and created new tensions, especially with Russia. It's killing us now, it's killing us in the future. Most probably ending NATO in all respects could have prevented the puppetery of Donald Trump and how he's using it as a mechanism to take advantage of the vast majority of people, sidestepping organizations and diminishing their overall importance in status quo. Practically speaking, 3 things we can recognize from the speech. 1, clear setup of where this debate actually exists in. 2, just going to analyze some argumentation in regards to why we think, in all likeliness, this particular structure is detrimental to the vast majority of people. Within that, you're going to get some form of weighing in regards to why those arguments win. Moving on to setup. America, ergo America being a person, Donald Trump, essentially is one that is centered upon making its own particular benefits. Let's face it, Donald
Oh, sorry. Okay. I paused you out at 1 minute and 1 second. You were talking about Donald Trump as a person, and you were describing his characteristics. Would you want to continue from there?
So the Donald Trump uses like a protection. He has a protectionist particular his administration follows in the protectionist ideals, so it doesn't necessarily cater for the interests of the vast majority of people. It only prioritizes the interests of America as an individual. This is to say that they're most probably going to take any opportunity to exploit the vast majority of organizations that they're in order to maximize the overall profitability, to maximize on the security, or moreover to maximize on the fulfilled interests. NATO in itself exists as a deterrent. Mutual defense treaties signed in 1961 essentially exist to provide the implication that mutual defense, in all instances, attack one of us, we attack all of you. This acts as a deterrent to the vast majority of international bodies or terrorist groups that want to attack these organizations. You can't, because you know you're going to get blown over. I think that's the key framing of where this debate actually lies in. Onto the first line of argumentation as to why NATO in itself should have been dismantled in 1991 and why economies fail because of that very virtue. The first argument then is quite simple in all its proximity. The premise of this argument is based on the 2% rule, which is very unrealistic and unattainable. This is to say 5% of the majority of the GDPs for all of the nations, the 23 out of 32 countries, have to meet a specific target where they have to spend so much money for all of the goods, to all of these like military defense programs, spending outrageous amount of money in developing these things. Why is this particularly true, and why does this particularly provide some form of significant harm? Fourfold, right? I think the first one is that there's short-termism of governments. This is to say that many of the pressing issues within status quo are not being fulfilled because they necessarily prioritizing military development and not necessarily prioritizing economic investments. This is to say unemployment becomes the most problematic thing in Yugoslavia because we at the end of the day didn't necessarily make some form of significant change at the end of like these organizations entirely. But then two, rebuilding their economies and post-war after the conflict. This is to say that we don't provide the attention required after building these economies after World War II. Look, it gives a take to like the Marshall Aid Plan given by the USA. This was a strategic move to implement like dollar imperialism so that the vast majority of international bodies adopt the particular structures and status quo instead of actually developing their own currencies, which could have made them much stronger but less dependent on the USA. Furthermore, the third reason here is that governments also tend to have no conflict with other countries. So it becomes very outrageous to actively spend so much money on military instead of actually developing a country, when the likelihood of war is not necessarily proximate to these individuals entirely. We say that in those instances at all, you're most probably not going to make a significant change. You're most probably going to stagnate because you keep doing the same thing without actually like developing your country to its maximum extent. The final point here is quite simple. Powerful countries can use their political will and direction. So especially when they have a lot of money and they have a lot of like disposable income to spend, or to spend this money, and it's really not even practical for like international organizations that even implement like this particular system. So for example, if the Brits have a lot of money, they're most probably going to dwarf like countries such as Serbia at the end of the day, because Serbia is spending so much money on this GDP, when yet it doesn't even make a dent in comparison to Britain. It's mostly unrealistic and unsustainable. What is the importance of this argument? We think countries are never going to meet the spending goals. They're neither going to have any clear-cut protection in the status quo, but even in the instances which they can find that particular protection, they leave themselves vulnerable to economic recessions, where the vast majority of these people suffer. Give or take in 2022.
Is it just me or the speaker just paused?
Yes, the speaker has broken off. Let me just see if we can get him back.
Sorry, I dropped out again. Can you... Hello?
Are you back?
Yeah, I'm back.
Okay. So I had stopped your timer at 4 minutes and 50 seconds. And what you were talking about was about this abuse of power. A point right after you had finished about like the dollar imperialism and like how, right after you had finished the point about dollar imperialism. So you can start from there.
So, all right, I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. With this particular dollar imperialism, governments such as the USA were able to take advantage of the vast majority of these Eastern European countries because they were desperate to get some form of benefit. We think the comparative one is like in a world without NATO, we have countries which have alliances, especially with countries that have actual real cut security issues, not prerequisites that they have to fulfill simply for the preconceived notion that there's going to be some war, which never comes in the end of the day. We think realistically, the bureaucratic processes, these themselves already push them into stifling debt that cannot actually save these countries. Countries which do not believe they require significant military spending, such as Slovenia and Luxembourg, are no longer beholden the pressure to be increasing their spending and stunt by their own development based on the social development and socialistic systems in status quo. We think holistically speaking, when you break away from these particular, you're most probably going to make that specific progression. Before I move on to my second line of argumentation, I'll take that POI.
The development you claim is a black hand gamble, as if this development is even to happen. These aggressors have to be stopped either one way or another, and these countries cannot do that without the NATO.
Actually, they can, because if you think about this particular premise that like majority of these countries already have loads of money themselves, they're most probably going to still like at least be able to defend themselves. I promise you, Britain can still is the 5th ranked country in regards to like military in general. We think in that particular context, they're most probably going to protect themselves. But let's assume that's not true. Even in the instance where they cannot protect themselves, we think there are other international organizations such as the UN that can actually provide a more proximate change, a more legitimate change, because they themselves are most likely going to even be able to do it. They're also mandated by them. But moreover, it's the West. They're most probably going to have Western members are part of the UN. There's most probably going to be a proximate incentive for the UN to actually step in, especially if it's Britain who's suffering the suffrage of being a part of that war. We think in all respects, we're very happy to take that role in general. Moving on to the second line of argumentation in regards to why we think this particular structure makes the NATO a puppeteer of the USA in general. It is quite simple. The truth here is that in all respects, you're most probably not going to make that significant change. You're most probably going to have Donald Trump simply taking advantage of these particular instances. Why is this particularly true? One, because of the very fact that the USA holds the majority region of NATO, representing 2/3 of the alliance's defense spending. So clear cut, he has a bargaining chip, especially with NATO. The moment you don't say yes to USA, the moment you don't necessarily have the amount of funding to actively develop this. Why is this particularly important? It means that in any instances when the action is carried out by NATO, such as the intervention
It's a speaker cut again, or it's me?
like Wi-Fi.
The speaker cut.
Can you hear me once more?
Yes, we can hear you. You cut again once more.
Right.
You started at 7 minutes and 8 seconds. Would you like to push for the last minute? You know.
Yes, please.
Okay, let's go.
So
Yeah.
3, 2, 1. Things such as the Arab Springs and had like significant people getting killed. It was like a consensus decision, but it really wasn't, because at the end of the day, it was the USA that actually pushed the countries to do this. Why is this particularly important? This part is particularly important because it gives the USA it gives the justification for the US foreign interference in affairs, which allows many of the USA to enforce its power in foreign regions and affect global politics under the guise of NATO. This essentially escalates the war and the polarization between NATO, especially when NATO forces are the ones who are aiding in these specific regions and are fighting proxy wars in areas such as Syria, killing many people and increasing the bloodshed amongst people. I think in Kosovo, there were like literally 5,000 people caused by the NATO operations. And in these instances as a whole, you're most probably not going to end that. What is the comparison? Like 3 seconds.
Yeah, you're on 7 minutes and 56 seconds. So let's wrap it up.
50 seconds, right? Okay, I'm just going to end the speech. I'm sorry for all the torture. 3, 2, 1. Comparative intervention would be much more limited by America, likely manifesting in the form of less direct assistance, such as humanitarian aid, and most probably these countries themselves wouldn't enter such bloodshed entirely. We win this debate the moment in which we actively remove the puppetery that has been caused by the USA. Donald Trump is a villain. He's going to destroy us. He's done so in the past. Very proud to win this debate.
Okay, thank you very much, opposition, for that riveting speech. We'll now like to call upon opposition to come and open the case on the opposition bench. Here.
Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are.
Okay, thank you so much. Is it a necessity to put on your camera?
It is highly encouraged, but if bandwidth is low, you might as well turn it off.
Yeah. Can't see myself.
Well, I think your bandwidth is low, so it would be advisable to turn off your camera because you're breaking on my end.
Sorry.
Hi, Brian.
Am I audible? Okay, I'm back. I'm sorry for that. Network issues. I will sorry for the delay. I will
Okay,
start.
Brian, great to have you back. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Can I check if
I'm
my
fine,
network is I'm not better now because I'm changing network.
You're a bit choppy now that you've turned on your camera.
Okay, I'll just start right now. It's very simple.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, I'll just start right now. 3, 2, 1. With the benefit of hindsight, knowing everything we know today, we on opposition firmly believe that the abolishing NATO after the fall of the USSR would have left the world far more unstable and vulnerable and unsafe. 2, 3 things are gonna get in my speech. Firstly, engagement. Secondly, context, and thirdly, my substantive. On to engagement and direct. I'm going to show you some direct rebuttal. I'm going to show you why the other side can't even I can't even stand for what they have said. So basically, what they have said basically is that there are also economic issues issues when you choose to be part of NATO and when you choose not to be part of NATO. This is to say that there are economic issues when you want to buy into this protection and when you don't want to buy into this protection, and when you want to or to go to some sort of influences from other countries. Our response is very simple. We rather have 5%, we rather opt into the 5% for the protection that is proven efficient. This is to say that on our side, we rather choose for a better devil, for a better person, for a better devil, if it comes to that certain fact or it comes to that certain scenario. They talked about how countries can protect themselves, like Britain, and without NATO and the use of even without NATO, the use of UN is here. Our response is very simple. The UN is unreliable. We have seen that the UN has been a failure to certain countries. It has been failed to certain countries, and it has not proven to be reliable and legitimate when it comes to certain scenarios like this. Two things here that we believe that is a necessity for us to prove. Then in our speech, we're going to prove to you why NATO is a necessity, and why we're going to prove to you why we are better on this side, and why NATO is some sort of like a better devil, and like why we would not want to opt into what a proposition or to say. The framing this debate is very simple, and what is hindsight actually looks like. This is a debate. This debate isn't whether if NATO made sense only during the Cold War. The debate is also about how we know the benefit of hindsight. We know that the world didn't become automatically peaceful in 1991. Instead, new threats emerged: terrorism, cyber war, hybrid attacks, authoritarian aggressions, and as you know, the UN has never done anything good ever then. NATO in itself has been proved to be essential and reliable afterwards the USSR was even abolished. So the real question before us is, knowing everything that we know now, would abolishing NATO after 1991 would have made the world safer or far more dangerous, and with that, we're so proud to oppose? We believe the answer is clear. Abolishing NATO would have created chaos, emboldened aggressors and dictators, dismantled the collective security that millions rely on today. The characterization that we put here is very, very simple too. Let's characterize the world after 1991, after the USSR was taken down. Russia was not fixed. It was politically unstable and economically devastated. Nationalism and imperial ambitions were steamed beneath the surface, paving a way for Putin's rise. As we know today, the Ukraine war and the Russian war. Dozens of people are facing a lot of discouragement from these certain wars that are happening. This is to show you how NATO is really needed in today's world. Dozens of newly independent states in the Eastern Europe and Central Asia are fragile and vulnerable of international conflict and foreign coercion. The new security challenges arose: terrorism, as we told you, cyber attacks, disinformation, a lot of that. Now we're going to get within our substantive and our case. But before then, let me show you NATO's relevance and the necessity in today's status quo. We have to tell you, and you know to understand, that NATO remains an absolute necessity for the global security and deterrence. Deterrence against major powers deterrence against major powers means this. It means that NATO exists precisely to deter aggression. We have seen time and time again how NATO acts as a shield, preventing both conventional evasions and some sort of attacks and threats from other countries. For instance, Russia's aggression in Ukraine has showed the need for NATO's presence, funding and military deployments to protect European states. If it is so true that countries can protect themselves, if it is so true, why is Ukraine already in war? If it is so true that countries can protect themselves without NATO, why is Ukraine in war? This is to show you that whatever they pose here is really, whatever opposition poses here about NATO not being a necessity is really, really wrong. Now, we ought to show you things in our case. Our first argument is basically all about abolishing NATO would have created a dangerous world and a dangerous power for vacuum. Without NATO, a fragile Eastern Europe countries like we get Poland have faced Russia alone. The hindsight proves that Russia became more aggressive, not less, as we have seen in Georgia, Ukraine as of now. NATO's presence stopped this aggression from expanding further. Abolishing NATO would have left European countries into the hands of Russia. The second argument we bring here is so simple. NATO adapts to modern threats and global crisis. NATO is successfully known to prevent genocides in Bonoshe, in Kogozozo, and led the counter-terrorism effort into Afghanistan after 9/11. This is research and information graphs. So therefore, protection was given to certain countries that were in threat from certain countries. This is to say, panel, that you know that how other countries, right? Let me bear with me, panel, and this is very simple. How other countries are being influenced in Eastern Europe, and this is to say that countries can go into those countries. Other countries can go with countries that have influence can go into those countries and exploit them, invade them, or do whatever they want. We get this with China and Thailand. And this is very important for you to write down and adhere to. Our third argument here is NATO safeguards democracy and shields nations from authoritarianism and influence. NATO is more than a military might. It's a symbol of democratic solidarity. It protects nations from Russian military threats, Chinese economic coercion, and cyber attacks aiming to destabilize democracies. Without NATO, small democracies would be isolated. Authoritarian regimes would shape global security norms and challenge. And what we have to say here is that NATO stands as a shield, not only for borders, but as a democratic shield for all we share. The conclusion here is very simple, panel. The conclusion here is to say that with the benefit of hindsight, abolishing NATO would have left Europe vulnerable to Russian aggression, exposed the world to new threats, without coordinated defense, undermine democracy and global stability. Even in 2025, NATO is not just relevant, it is essential. It remains the world's shield against chaos, authoritarian power, and emerging threats. With that, panel, I'm so proud.
Thank you, O1, for that exciting speech. P2.
Just to confirm that I am both audible and visible. All right, let me just set up my timer real quick. And I'd like to thank everyone for being here. It has been a fun debate. It's been a fun tournament. I'd like to thank my team members. They have been helping me throughout this whole debate. I would not be here without them. And yeah, I'd also like to take a token of appreciation to my coaches. They've really helped me, specifically Coach Mace. Thank you. And I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. All right, let's analyze something real quick. How exactly these countries would have basically functioned after NATO has actually been dissolved right after the USSR. We think that generally there would be less security threats specifically towards Russia, thus there would be no need for this aggression towards Ukraine in the first place. We think particularly because of the fact that Ukraine has showed basic interest in joining NATO, this specifically means that Russia has inherently had the drive to actually go after Ukraine in this instance and actively hurt it. What is the comparative therefore on our side? We think on our side generally what would have happened is that Russia would generally have no reason to go into Ukraine or would have no reason to start this war. Why exactly? Because notice that there was power imbalances specifically after the dissolvement of the USSR. Specifically after it has dissolved, we think particularly what happened was that Russia lost a significant amount of power, and we actively see this in the current war against Ukraine. What do we mean by this? We mean by the fact that USA has actually been able to actively put sanctions on Russia, and Russia has has lost like, about 300 million in US dollars alone, right? It has put a dent in the Russian market, particularly because of the fact that now America is one of the leading powerhouses. We think generally there is no incentive to actively make some form of war anymore in this current day in society, particularly because of the fact that the enemy here, aka Russia, has actively lost a significant amount of power, particularly because of the fact that there is a significant amount of power lost. There is less likelihood that Russia would ever come into play in order to come, destroy other countries. It is not just thinking mindlessly, it is thinking about its social security, right? And also, what if side opposition comes here to say that, okay, we think in the general future there is going to be some instance whereby Russia ascertains power, and because it ascertains power, that therefore means that we are going to actively pursue NATO, specifically because of the fact that we don't want this to become a probability. Notice panel that specifically because of the fact that the dynamics have already shifted, it basically means that USA doesn't really have to compete with Russia anymore. In the instance that USA generally has the means to actually make sure that Russia cannot have its rise again, right? And to say that Vladimir Putin cannot ascertain enough power to actively bully other countries as it was before. We don't inherently think imperialism is going to be threatened in this certain way, and we don't inherently think communism is going to have another great rise. We think generally the world is already fixated on the fact that the power dynamics is shifting more towards the West rather than giving them back to Russia, which side opposition claims as the likely aggressor in that instance, where when NATO is actually dissolved, and then therefore, because there's no NATO, there would be no instance of Russia actually invading another country, right? So we knock off that argument that they actually have. But nextly, what do they want to go on to say? They want to go on to say that basically NATO is a symbol of democracy, and because NATO is a symbol of democracy, then this inherently means that other countries are able to follow pursuit, right? And this is an assumption basically because we get little analysis from the first speaker as to why this would be the case. But notice, even if there was analysis, right, in this argument, we think that generally NATO is kind of contradictory as a symbol of democracy. What do we mean by this? We mean by the fact that there are severe power imbalances within NATO, and particularly because of these power imbalances, you're already giving one of the global powerhouses more power than they actively deserve, or more power than they should ascertain. What do we mean by this? We mean by America basically having power over the world, and it actively toys with our lives, specifically by the fact that Trump announces new tariffs that could actively destroy the world economy, and he just does this casually in one night without any warning whatsoever. We think particularly because of this, it's an example of the fact that generally USA cannot be trusted with so much power as to the fact that it could actively have these power imbalances upon these other countries that are inside NATO, and that it has the means to actively rule out democracies, particularly because of the fact that the main contributor is USA. So therefore, it would most likely get the most say in instances and in arguments and in decisions for NATO. Before I continue onwards, I'll take up PI.
You claim USA to be a member of NATO, but it's only standing as an ally, and its influence is very limited to ally possibilities. Please engage on that. The USA is only an ally of NATO and is only as ally capabilities and does not have that much veto power. Please engage.
Okay, notice that the USA's power is basically disproportionate, particularly because of the fact that it's one of the main contributors of NATO in the first place, right? We think USA's position in NATO has actively gone to an egregious extent such that USA is actually able to make decisions for NATO in this instance. We mean by the fact that the bare minimum was 2% for you to actively enter NATO, and then America offers 100 times what you're contributing. We think generally there are power disbalances and there are disparities there that you can actively rule out. We think that this debate is inherently more unique than side of opposition actively claims it to be. But nextly, what therefore is a comparative on our side in the world that doesn't have NATO inherently? We think that USA is not able to actively accrue so much power that it is not able to keep the centralized view of America in this instance, right? What do we mean by this? We mean by the fact that USA can basically toy with other countries. It has the most used currency in the world, aka the US dollar, and particularly because of this, there is more of a power imbalance and disparity. But also additionally upon that, we think particularly because of the fact that it has influence over NATO to some degree, we think inherently what happens is that therefore you give USA even more power to pull a move such as the tariffs, whereby in one night he basically ruined the economy of several countries, and he basically threatened everyone casually without inherently putting in much effort. We think this is an example of the power disparity that side opposition is basically vying for. We think inherently what we want to do is have a more peaceful world, whereby number one, USA has a more reasonable amount of power in such that it is able to keep Russia in check. But additionally, Russia is not likely to actively go after Ukraine, particularly because of the fact that there's no social security in that instance, right? What do we mean by this? We mean by the fact that inherently, because NATO is basically anti-Russia, it is seen as an anti-Russia movement against Russia when Ukraine tries to actively go towards NATO. Because Ukraine had made this threat against Russia, which Russia sees it as, we think that Russia was therefore saying that, okay, I'm justified in actively pursuing some form of war, and I'm justified in killing more lives. Notice therefore the principles on our side of the house. Basically, we have the instance of that we're protecting more people proportionally, particularly because of the fact that there is more security on our side of the house. In the instance that there is more global security, particularly because of the fact that we are dissolving something that is made, something that has lost its purpose already. In the instance that the USSR was basically the whole purpose of NATO, and particularly because of the fact that it was against the USSR, and USSR has basically dissolved, we think we're bringing a fine conclusion to NATO in this instance. Because of this conclusion, we think therefore we achieve a few things within this debate. Number one, we achieve more security for the countries on our side of the house, and number two, we achieve more economic liberation upon these countries. What do we mean by this? Well, the characterization from my first speaker was basically that, look at it like this, all right? These countries have already contributed so much to NATO, and yet it's to an unreasonable extent, particularly because of the fact that there are already certain checks and balances to keep certain powers in place in order to actively achieve some form of world stability. We think therefore you could focus this 2% on other reasonable aspects upon your country, and particularly because of the fact that it's so centralized towards your country and not going outside of the borders, out of order. This is it's protected time. We think particularly because of the fact that it is so centrally focused upon your country, we think it is more important that you actively value the citizens that you have to protect inside your country. We think this could look like these countries having more economic progression or more economic productivity, particularly because of the fact that they have more spare money upon their hands. Because they have this money upon their hands, they're able to alleviate themselves from more economic disparities. Panel, we think if you want a reasonable world with the actual progression, with actual stability, and with less wars and with less death, we think you'd rather go for side proposition if you go for all humanitarian principles. Thank you.
Thank you, Prop 2, for that speech. Prop 2. Also, please do be reminded to just run an external timer just in case, just to make sure you know when you're running POIs in time, just to avoid asking POIs out of order. I will do some hand gestures just so that you can see when time for 7 minutes is up. That way you know you're no longer eligible to ask POIs.
Okay, am I audible? Am I audible for everyone?
Yes, very much.
Okay, so before I start, I'd like to thank my teammates, Brian and Machida, along with everyone else who's not available currently, and my coaches, Coach Mace, Coach Methembe, Coach Zukisani, and Coach everyone who has coached me to this moment. I would have made it here without you. And I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Now, panel, we find it funny when we have seen time and time again how NATO has acted as a deterrent for future aggressions and threats to European superpowers and even weaker powers, even countries in South Asian Pacific, like Taiwan, with the help of USA. This deterrence has been essential in rebutting Chinese influence, along with Russian aggression, with Ukraine as NATO has funded military development, troop deployment. Even post USSR's downfall, NATO still did damage control, which was failed by so many other organizations. For example, the savior of side proposition, which is the UN. Proud to oppose. Now, what will you find in my speech? Number one, you'll find engagement along with rebuttals, for all the points developed by side proposition and what they failed to do, and better clarification along with strategic points, starting off with rebuttals. Now, on the point of security, which has been mainly raised throughout their speech and has been coherent, panel, let's discuss on security then. 2 responses. The security they claim is what they hate at most, and which I find funny. Firstly, Barry came up here trying to develop the UN to seem as the security power and the better option of the 2 devils in this notice panel. But we tell you that the UN has been a tale of failure time and time again. From is a tale as old as history as itself, panel. What has the UN done? The UN has failed to control the US and has only led to it, only forcing it to become an extended limb of the USA, relying on its funding, whereas NATO is completely run and only an ally of the USA, as you have seen it actually deny USA's influence on trying to send ballistic missiles to Russia and only trying to mediate with Russia, to denying to be involved in the Iraqi war and the invasion of Iran with the help of USA. So showing how the NATO has actually become the better option of the two, whereas the UN has become a cancer patient without chemotherapy in this instance, panel. Now, moving on to the USA's influence and also how it has developed in NATO, which has become one of their main points, panel. We tell you the USA is not actually an influential member, panel. One, it has no veto power. Two, it has no strategic influence. And three, even in economical influence, panel, it has no balance. As it stands with no limb, panel is only crippled inside a chair to only vote on its decisions and only help where it can. For example, NATO has a standing army, the UN doesn't. That's why it requires the USA's need. NATO has the economical strength to provide for itself, the UN doesn't. NATO has the power for the nations to actually allow veto power of even weaker nations. What does USA do? USA only controls the UN because it has more money. NATO does not play that gambling game. NATO helps develop countries. Now, why would NATO be important even though in the post-USSR world, panel? Now, let me tell you why. Moving on to the developed arguments. In terms of economic growth, panel, yes, we agree to the point that the NATO's requirement for 5% of a country's GDP is actually very fair, and we stand on hard line on this, panel. Why do we say that, panel? When you do not opt for this or buy into this, panel, what do you have? You're entering a black hand or a gamble, panel, with already unfair hand. And just as in blackjack, to reach 21, that means you have won. Over past it, you have lost. Now, not opting for this, panel, you enter into a world where you're already entering with a card that equals 20 and only have one more chance to win, which is the world that they're providing you with in their best case scenario on such proposition, panel. Now, we tell you, opt into our world, panel. You pay that 5% over a long term if you cannot pay upfront, panel, which has NATO done for even countries like Spain currently, as it is doing also, panel. If you opt into that, panel, what you have collective security, which has actually been proven to work in so many instances. For example, in the battle of Turkey, Greece, and Cyprus, panel, which has turned it all over around. And Cyprus is now a developing country, along with Turkey and Greece still thriving, panel, and becoming better countries through to the help of what? The NATO treat and pact, panel. Whereas with the UN's option, which is their savior or the Jesus Christ in this option, panel, what do you have? You have more deterrence, more failure, panel. And if you fail to pay up for even this collective security, panel, upfront, you're immediately kicked out and only offered more and more deterrence to your country without any help, panel. Moving on to why we require NATO in this instance. Now, enhance of stability and security. NATO's presence helps maintain stability and security in the region, deterring potential aggressors and promoting a sense of security among member countries, panel. Now, yes, the USSR is gone, which was NATO's main threat back then until Mikhail Gorbachev stepped down of the USSR, panel. But what aggressors do we have now? Well, the aggressors such as China going on with threats of it coming down into Europe, as China now eyes countries like Taiwan going further down, even up to Poland and even the eastern regions of Europe, panel. What other aggressors do we have? We have Russia, whose grievances have been expressed, panel. Even after the Warsaw Pact long back, panel, they still have grievances. What do they want to recollect? They want to recollect land, resources, and appropriation for other countries, which they lost in this division, which was done by NATO fairly and equally, panel. Fair and fine, all's fair in love and war, panel. But we tell you this: what has NATO done? NATO has managed to help deter and actually keep these aggressors in check. How has it done so, panel? Working with an ally, note the word ally that I said, panel. Do not let that proposition gaslight you into saying that USA is a member of NATO. An ally with the USA, sending most of its own standing army, panel, to keep Taiwan safe and also under control from Chinese communism, rushing in, panel. What has it also done on the Russian side, panel? It's actually managed to deter the war, panel, as the NATO, even Ukraine admitted itself that the war was supposed to end in 2 weeks. Let me finish my point. The war was supposed to end in 2 weeks against Russia and Ukraine Ukraine need to be falling along with Poland and any other countries. What did NATO do? NATO actually had the talks, the peace talks, and even sustained Ukraine's war efforts without appropriating larger damage such as the UN has done for the times. Accepted.
The average country within the UN, within the NATO, is not threatened by any other international country. It's threatened by its own economic recession, suffering because of that military spending. Please engage on how you fix that.
And Barry, tell you that point is false. Number one, why? We've seen countries like Poland, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, Cyprus, countries which are actually a threat of Eastern influence from Russia, China, and many other countries who are just weaker than them. Now, we tell you why is it a better option to opt into NATO? One, you deter that threat. While he's being able to keep number one, which is my next point, trade with these countries inside NATO panel, which facilitates more trade with the euros and also pounds to allow Europe's growth without the influence of other external powers. Now, we're saying that this point of these external threats not happening panel, which is an immediate threat panel. This external that is actually happening. As you see war breaking out left and right panel, sides are being drawn, but NATO is the only side that's still standing strong panel with its beliefs and unity and also autonomy panel, showing you that NATO is actually beneficial in this stance as these immediate threats are happening currently panel, not what that proposition is trying to tell you and lie to you and feed to you panel. Moving on to my next point. Panel. Number 2. Promoting democratic values, as Brian said. NATO promotes democratic values such as individual liberty, democracy, and the rule of law, which are essential for maintaining peace and security. Now, we tell you that NATO is not dominated by one country or one country per se panel. NATO has a board. Who's this board? The European Union, which governs it panel, and also allows and facilitates all of its trade, union marketing, war efforts, and also deterrence measures, which are done by NATO panel. Now, why is this good panel? It allows, number 1, trade and also democratic values. Whereas to the latter option of the tribe proposition, whereas if UN is involved in such things panel, it forces its own dictatorship onto your country, takes you to the ICJ and forces you into your own submission or tapping out, which means that you relieve the leader that you have chosen, as it done in Iran, in Iraq, and we've seen how far that's gone. Complete failure. Like I said, a cancer patient without chemotherapy is what UN is becoming panel. Whereas in NATO, once a deterrent is stopped panel, what do? They allow the people to vote. They hold an autonomous vote panel. People vote for their leader, and NATO completely excludes itself from whatever is happening in the country, leaving the country to their resources, and not a form of neocolonialism as the UN is trying to perpetuate in the form of the USA's advancement panel. Moving on to cooperation and partnerships, as I've said before panel, NATO's partnerships with other countries and organizations enhances the ability to address global security challenges and promote stability. Moving on to global security challenges panel. Now, why do you tell you that NATO's relevance is still perfect even after the USSR's fall panel? Even today's world, we do not see threats which were built under the old philosophy of the UN of just war influence or the Cold War influence panel. No, we see threats of cybersecurity, hacking, and even cyber war panel, even biological warfare panel, which is being used currently panel, so that NATO actually deters these things panel. So actually, with the cybersecurity boards actually working in the day and night panel to stop cybersecurity hacking between countries panel, which is something that was not done back then, showing how NATO is still important to help these countries that are not developed into the technological age panel and still help them stay away from aggressors and also further influence to fall under these panel. Now, why? Moving on to a final substantive matter and also comparing and comparison panel, which we shall be carried on by my TIDA and final speech panel. Now, with that, I'm proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you very much for that exciting speech. Was that O2, P3?
Can you confirm if I'm both audible and visible? All right, cool. Just a few minutes to set my timer. Otherwise, thank you guys for that wonderful debate. Looking forward to the best for each of the teams. Shout out to RPDA and shout out to my teammates from Zimbabwe. Having said that, I'll be taking my POIs verbally at any point in my speech, but please do not badger me. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. The existence of NATO and the continuous existence of NATO simply looks like we are keeping all these countries on a leash. An example here is that all the benefits that we get from side opposition simply looks like a dog that is kept on a leash with its radius limited to the extent in which the leash allows you to move. We think all these benefits that they give us fair and fine, but this debate is not about debating on benefits, but we look at the extent, the scope, and the magnitude to which the existence and the continuous existence of the NATO after the fall of the USSR has continued. We do believe that the existence of the NATO has been more harmful than good for particular reasons which they failed to engage on. Firstly, we think the idea on power dynamics has been so undermined in this debate. And secondly, there is the idea on countries benefiting. Panel notice here, if countries were continuously benefiting from the existence of NATO, we wouldn't have problems within the European economic crisis that we currently have within status quo. Because of the existence of NATO, we do believe that countries have continuously been asked to give their form of GDP, but they don't benefit to that analogy. They are benefiting at a minimal, and it is not in and of itself helping them uplift their economic crisis, but rather it is causing economic stagnation. All the benefits that have been stated by opposition, which was basically their entire case, are not exclusive. We do believe all those benefits can still exist in a world where NATO was continuously dismantled, and we do believe opposition should engage on that fact. But lastly, the major contention in this debate was that we don't agree on the idea that NATO itself is democratic. We think for countries to actually develop, NATO does not need to be influenced by USA. I will explain this within our clashes, but we think they have brushed off the idea of the USA dominance and the idea that the continuous existence of NATO has caused the conflicts that we have within status quo. Moving on to the biggest clashes within this debate, which are two major clashes. Firstly, on the dominance of USA, and secondly, on the peace and resolving conflict of status quo. Just to explain the clash on dominance of USA, I'll notice here that during the war of the USSR, the Cold War, we think there was a political vacuum in and of itself. The only country that was able to actually close that political vacuum and that had so much power to close that political vacuum was USA. We think in that particular case, that is when NATO was formed and that's when NATO began to exist. But because of the power and the influence of the USA, that is inherently where it began to influence the decisions of the NATO. We think also when NATO began to expand, NATO expanded in the form and in the interest of the USA. We gave you this within the first speech itself, but they don't engage on that particular idea. We think also when they try to tell you that USA is just an ally, fair and fine, but we still do believe that USA influences the decisions of NATO and USA works inside of NATO. Look at, for example, how USA can simply bypass the voting processes of NATO. We think that is just giving USA some form of power. And when USA is treating all these countries as puppets, and when NATO itself is used just to shoot against USA, we do believe all these benefits that they raise are somewhat outweighed by the puppetship and the lack of democracy. All these benefits that they want to achieve are not exclusive. They can still exist in a world where NATO is completely dismantled. Why do we then win this clash in and of itself? We think it was funny how we get from the second speech speaker how they said, look, countries are actually developing. Panel, giving us one example of a country that is already developed does not mean that all the Western, all the European countries have developed. We tell you there is economic stagnation that is existing. All these countries are continuously asked to give their form of GDP to this form of NATO, but they don't develop in and of itself. We tell you of countries such as Britain and France. We think in that particular case, it still looks like some form of economic stagnation, and we still do believe that NATO itself was failing there. We win this clash, therefore, because we then do away with the dominance of USA. We allow these countries some form of economic liberation. We allow these countries to develop themselves, and we allow these countries not to be held and to be tied to a leash that is just NATO. In this case, we do believe NATO is not serving its purpose, and NATO is just keeping these individuals on a leash and just being held as a puppet for the USA. But secondly, then on peace and resolving conflict, and now they don't really understand what really happened when during the fight or the fall of the USSR. We think in that particular case, this is something that has made the Russians very angry because the existence of NATO re-invokes Russia's laws. And because of the re-invoking of Russia's laws, we do believe in that particular case, Russia becomes mad. And we see in status quo, Russia is continuously seeking for conflicts and all these wars that we're currently facing in status quo. We could have abated this if NATO simply didn't exist. That is why the motion comes here and tells you that in that particular, considering the forehand, we do believe that NATO shouldn't have existed. In that particular case, we do believe when NATO's expansion was existing, it was inherently and directly challenging the influence of Russia. And that is when we started this war conflict and these wars. We think for this conflict to not exist in status quo, it would have been better if NATO was completely dismantled and NATO didn't exist. In that particular world, we do believe we would have achieved some form of peace, and secondly, we would have reduced the influence of Russia itself. Because look how there is now the Western and Eastern conflict in and of itself within status quo. We do believe also if NATO actually had fallen, this would have acted like some form of deterrence to Russia itself. We wouldn't be where we are today, because at that particular time, even Russia was facing wars, and we think if NATO didn't exist, it would have been better. But just on impacting itself on our entire case, why we still win on comparisons. We win on two levels. Firstly, we give this country some form of sovereignty. What does side opposition inherently argue? They argue that they want to have some form of trading, economics. We do believe, besides telling you that this is not exclusive, this is not something that is inherent inherently bypassing the sovereignty and the extent of their harm. We already win this debate just on weighing on scope and magnitude. When a lot of countries compared to the vast miniature countries that they try to give you in the second speech and tell you that, look, country XYZ is inherently benefiting from NATO and their economies are developing. Just on scope alone, they sell themselves and they lose this debate because inherently there's economic stagnation within the European circuit. But secondly, on magnitude itself, the continuous existence of NATO for far, far too long has continuously made Russia and USA become dominant countries and has continuously given USA this global superpower countries and made USA big controlling all these countries that are in NATO. We do believe this is not anything that can supersede the sovereignty and the democracy of all these countries. What you want to achieve is countries that are either rather democratic and countries that can rather develop themselves. Rather than NATO continuously claiming to have the 5% GDP, let these countries develop their own countries. Let these countries use their own GDP to their own development. We do believe in the second speech, we gave you an analysis of how economic liberation exists in our side and why economic liberation is inherently important. Side opposition hinges their case on benefits. We want them to give us an analysis on weighing alone, how they still win with all this analysis to tell you that even if they give us a whole debate on benefits, the existence of NATO has caused more harm than good. Its magnitude has been so detrimental to cause what you're currently having in status quo, the likes of things such as conflicts and wars. We are the side that gives you 5 benefits, peace, we give you our sovereignty. So even if we're just arguing on benefits alone, we still win on the extent to which our benefits are more valuable than what you get from side opposition. Having said that, panel, we have never been more prouder to propose and win this debate. We're proud.
Thank you, P3, for that exciting speech. O3.
Okay, so I will work under the assumption that I am both audible and visible. I'd like to thank, first of all, before I start my speech, I'd like to thank my teammates for the great work that we've done to come here. I'd like to thank Coach Mace, Coach Methembe, and all the other academy coaches. And shout out to RPDA and everyone else who's just been at this tournament. So without further ado, I will start in 3, 2, 1. Now, panel case, our core case is that NATO remained and continues to remain necessary even after the USSR collapses. We give you 3 main contentions. We talk about economic development within these countries, and we say that NATO was something that was able to transcend and adapt to constant changes in the environment surrounding these countries. But not only that, we also bring a contention in which we say that it is necessary for the military safety of these countries. What we talk about during that time period after the collapse of the USSR, there's so much instability within Europe, especially within that region. We tell you about how Russia as a powerhouse was falling, but still had a lot of power. And these countries which had been freed from their reign were still very sensitive, very economically undeveloped, and very militarily undeveloped. We tell you about the necessity of NATO to keep for the betterment of these countries' status quo. And we tell you throughout this debate that when we look at a scenario in which NATO had been abolished straight after the USSR's collapse, we see a situation in which these countries had more Russian influence over them, in which these countries did not have room to develop as much, and in which these countries would be so much overlooked, so much prouder to propose. Now, before we start our debate, let's talk about the main contention which we face in this debate. We face a contention on proven security versus idealism. Well, we talk our West Side of our proposition tries to give us an idealistic situation in which without NATO, these countries would have been better. Without NATO, these countries would have been able to evolve by themselves. These countries would have been able to develop by themselves. These countries would have been able to actually make some lasting change by themselves. They tell us this by saying that because of NATO, we have so many echo chambers, and these echo chambers are propagating the same ideas over and over again. So these countries don't have room to develop by themselves because they lack any real autonomy. Now, we tell you that, panel, this is not just wrong, it's insulting to countries that chose NATO to protect their right to exist. First, development needs stability. Countries like Estonia, Poland, and Latvia, all NATO members, became prosperous democracies with digital economies because NATO gave them security to build. Now, this is important on 2 levels. First of all, we recognize the fact that NATO started as a military organization, and its main objective was to protect these countries from Russia. However, we then also say that it was beneficial that NATO was able to remain around because then they were able able to evolve and transcend into a domain where they're hoping these countries, by creating trade blocks, by creating chains where these countries could be able to talk, could be able to collaborate with other countries, by creating a scenario in which none of these countries could be exploited. On a second level, we take a look at the situation right after the collapse of USSR Russia. We tell you that right after the collapse of Russia, a lot of Russia itself was also very weak. However, that did not stop the fact that Russia was still one of the largest countries in Europe. Russia was still one of the largest countries within that specified region, and Russia was still economically far better off than these countries. A lot of these countries were actually economically undeveloped because of the amount of Russian pressure that they had on them, and they didn't know how to run their countries properly. A lot of these countries didn't have that military strength to be able to help themselves. Now, what NATO then comes in and does is say, okay, let's put all these countries under a collective so that not only Russia but other countries cannot come and take advantage of them. And because of that, these countries were able to be put in a space where they could collaborate with other countries, in which these countries could be able to form trade blocks, in which they could get foreign development. Foreign development would come because other foreign countries from regions outside of Europe would recognize that, okay, this country is a part of NATO. That means this country is safe, and that means this country is stable, and that means that means my investment is good, and that means my investment is safe. And because of that, NATO is actually furthering the development of this country. We don't really feel that it's legitimate for you to say that NATO accepted. Okay, I can't hear anything, so I'm going to continue my speech. Now, we talk about...
Please provide... Sorry. In regards to that, I don't get the incentive as to why Russia would attack people if you already concede that they were weak. So in nature, why would there be incentive for them to take advantage of these countries in the 1990s? Please engage.
Okay, I was going to get into that, but since you wanted me to talk about it. Now, we have countries like Moldova, Belarus. These countries are countries that opted out of joining NATO. Now, while Russia was still weak in that time period, remember, I said Russia was weak, however, relatively compared to other NATO countries, Russia was still strong. Russia was still economically stable. Russia still had power to take over and influence these countries. Russia now has lots of influence and has a stronghold over Moldova and Belarus. And because of that, these countries are economically underdeveloped. These countries have a lot of Russian influence over them, and these countries have not been able to have any actual autonomy because these countries opted out of joining NATO, and these countries left themselves vulnerable because they didn't realize the fact that they didn't have any actual experience, that they didn't have anyone to protect themselves. We say that NATO transcended past being just a shield, and instead NATO became a full armor. It became both the shield, both the protector and the attacker, stopping countries not only from being taken advantage of, but being able to put countries in spaces in which they themselves could be able to develop for themselves. Now, on a second level, we talk about realism and optimism, where they try to tell us that post-NATO, these countries are post-NATO. Sorry, is that time?
Continue.
All right. Now we talk about on a second level. We talk about how we talk about post-USSR transition would have been very difficult for a lot of these countries, and we talk about the fact that because of NATO, this was much easier because these countries were being able to put into these spaces. But then on a global scope, something which we were able to go into, something that the side proposition completely failed to go into. We talk about how much collaboration and how much better NATO was than comparably the UN. Why? Because NATO is something that doesn't have one country that has more influence than the other. NATO was something that redistributed power in a fair and proper manner. And we see that because of this, when they try to argue about power disparities, we don't really feel like that's a legitimate argument to try and run here, because NATO, its main objective after military protection was also power distribution, so that each and every country could stand an adequate chance. Do you want to tell me that a country like Georgia stood a chance against the Russian attacks back in 2003 if it wasn't for NATO intervention, if it wasn't for that redistribution of power, if it wasn't for those funds that they also gained from being able to collaborate with NATO to be able to bolster the economic strength? We don't feel that it's valid for you to be able to talk about power disparities without recognizing the fact that power disparities already existed. NATO was just the solution, not the problem. Then now into our main rebuttals. We talk about how and they talk about they like to talk about how how NATO is a tool of US imperialism. Yes, the US is influential in NATO. Influential. It does not make the decisions. It is influential. That is, but it is not in control. NATO is consensus based. Every country has a veto. In fact, in 2003, we talk about the situation in Iran. France, Germany, and all the other countries which were involved with NATO refused to support the Iraq War, and NATO as an alliance did not go in. That's not a puppet. We don't feel that is control. We see that as an autonomy. We see that as autonomy on NATO's own part to say we don't really agree with this, and so we don't feel that it's legitimate for us to join in with you. Now, you see, it's not legitimate for you to say that the US has so much influence and it uses NATO as some kind of a weapon when you don't actually know the situation that has happened. We're not arguing in hindsight. We're talking about past situation. This is a proven past situation that NATO itself does not necessarily have to fall to US influence. It's not legitimate for you. It's not fair for you to try and argue that when you yourself do not know what the situation itself looks like. We are arguing status quo, we're arguing what happens in the past, and we're arguing how we feel that is much better than the situation which side proposition is supposed to bring us. However, their analysis is really lacking because they themselves fail to understand what the situation was like back in Europe in 1991. And they try to tell us about how how NATO has aggravated Russia towards third and second speaker. However, that's also something we feel is unfair yet again, because Russia was not aggravated by the presence of NATO. Russia was aggravated by authoritarianism, as my first and second speaker, and now I am going to say it was aggravated by pride, authoritarianism, and the need for control and dominance within those European areas. And because of that, the only reason that Russia is still trying to aggravate these wars is because of its own pride. And because of its own pride and need for power. Unfortunately, due to the jealousy of my time, I cannot continue. Never prouded.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Opi, for that speech. I'll reply. I'll reply.
Am I audible? Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, you are.
Okay. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Now, panel, in terms of who has won this debate, we believe there are 3 deciding factors. Firstly, provides more security for these European countries and even the global perspective, even after the fall of USSR and in the future. Secondly, who provides more economic stability and also economic and global trading ability in the latter future. And number 3, which Messiah is better? The proposition side Messiah of the UN or our opposition side of the better option of NATO, which I have described fully in our debate. Now, no comparison allows you to make this a better and worse word analysis, which you'll find throughout my speech. So firstly, panel, on the point of security, 2 responses, panel. We have shown you how security is largely more exclusive on our side. 1, we don't offer you a black hand gamble as opposed to proposition side panel, where they offer you a black hand gamble with the only likely chance of you surviving war is if you have developed it economically enough in such a short space of time, would you tell you it's impossible and just fictional panel. Whereas we offer you a better option where as you can pay these installments for collective security at a better rate and later options without any interest, as countries such as Spain are doing already panel, and also provide you security and also economic development along with the trading options which NATO carries. Secondly, on the point of economic development panel, now we pan back to the point of trading options that NATO carries panel. NATO allows countries to trade among themselves and also facilitates trade for smaller countries with bigger international countries panel, even outside of the European scope panel, allowing better trade. As they've seen in countries such as Montenegro, which has actually grown its trade, Cyprus, and also Bosnia-Herzegovina panel, which has grown its trade due to the help of NATO, but still managing to pay this 5% of the collective security fee of their GDP, but it's still growing panel, which showing that the point and lies which have been brought up by side proposition are completely false and fabricated panel. Now, thirdly, on the point of global cooperation and also helping out in the steady growth of these countries panel. Now, what do you get from our speech panel? We've shown you everything else that is better panel, and which is the better latter option, and which is the better Messiah. We tell you it's NATO panel because 1, Inside proposition side, you find a clashing ideology and logical case panel. Firstly, the thing that they tell you to hate the most, the USA, and call it a third panel, is the same thing they want to run back to in forms of the UN. Even though the UN is more completely controlled by the USA, as the USA's members sit at the top of the panel and also do not have any governing court besides the ICJ, mainly made up of what? USA members panel and also USA influence and USA movement and USA supporters panel. What do you get on our side panel? You get a better option where USA is only an ally without, number one, veto power, number two, without the option to make any moves, without the complete discretion and also allowing of NATO panel. As you've given examples, for example, in NATO refusing to engage in the Iraqi war, and NATO also refusing to send ballistic missiles to Russia panel, showing that NATO is completely autonomous panel and does not require the USA's need help or fund, as USA is barely providing fund at the moment to either NATO or the UN, but NATO is still thriving as opposed to the UN panel. Now, why do we win this debate panel? Moving on to the better world scenario. Now, in their world panel, NATO dissolves. What do we get then? We get an instability. We get an unfair balance panel. We see these countries failing and falling panel just because they don't have anything else to keep them panel. And war becomes imminent panel. The folklore of World War III becomes reality. Countries and influence becomes a more powerful panel. China comes in from the west, Russia from the east. And what do you have? We have a centerpiece panel with Iran and Iraq meeting at the Middle East panel of the Southeast Pacific, along with the European Pacific panel, with big countries such as Britain and France, who they claim can protect themselves panel, failing due to these revolutions that are happening panel around the world panel, and these countries also benefiting from NATO themselves panel, showing that our world is more better. Now, what do you get in our world? NATO remains and people grow strong and people happen. And these countries get to keep their GDP panel, grow economically, militarily, and security panel is still moved on without the option to gamble or choose a better devil panel, because the better devil they're opening panel is just the thing they're trying to run away from panel. And the UN is only just a cancer patient without chemotherapy. And with that, I've never been prouder to oppose.
Thank you, Op-Reply, for that speech. Prop-Reply, to come and round up the debate.
All right, can you hear me if I speak like this? All right, perfect. So I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Thank you, Team RPDA. This was quite the round, quite the easiest final, in my opinion, to win. I'm just going to show you why realistically in this speech. First key element then is they don't really prove exclusivity of their own arguments. Let's start from the beginning. Security. They claim to us it's the main push that they have, that security is most probably going to be fulfilled on their side of the house. That's great and all, but I think that security is still going to be a symmetrical point. We give you loads of analysis in first speech as to why that's true. Look, the UN exists. These are Western European nations that exist in the UN. Britain, France, they're most probably going to get a lot of seats. They're most probably going to incentivize some form of a change if there is an unlikely chance that war actually happens. We give you loads of reasons as to why even if war exists, you're most probably going to get a chance internationally. 2, interests and validations of Russia is less likely going to push them into going into war, because already both sides of the house can see that they are initially weak. So in all respects, if they try go and actually do that against the country, they're most probably going to lose a lot of money. They're most probably not even going to be able to fulfill their interests. But then furthermore, we also told you about actors such as the USA who keep Russia in check because of the homogeneity that these particular countries hold. We think in all respects, panel, this argument can't fly, especially when the security exists on both sides of the house. They don't prove exclusivity. They lose on that clash entirely. But which clash do they lose even more? The one called economy. The economic clash is the most important one, in my opinion, because it's the most proximate to the vast majority of these people. We clearly told you that there's a less likelihood of war actually occurring in these particular NATO countries. Therefore, it becomes ludicrous that they spend at least 5% of their GDP trying to fix some form of militaristic intent that is not even going to be beneficial to them in the next 10 years, because war is less likely even going to happen in those regions, right? We think what this does, it stagnates the economies of these particular things. I think the Euro fell by like 4% the last month, right? And that's realistically due to the significant expenses that this country has due to its involvement, internationally speaking, when it comes to militaristic intent. We think in all respects, panel, they cannot really win this clash, especially because they forfeit any right into actually fixing the economy. They're willing to have all of these countries have like spend so much money. I think Loiso tries a very weird thing to say that we can co-opt this benefit because we have better trade deals in NATO. Cool, fair and fine, but that's still not mutually exclusive to NATO. I think the international alliances with different countries that you can still implement. The IMF the IMF actually gives those particular alliances, essentially, I don't realistically see where the exclusivity of this benefit comes from. Panel, in all respects, we win this debate the moment in which we're able to benefit the vast majority of people in status quo. On the comparative, we show that to you the moment in which you're most probably going to achieve that, when people themselves are most probably going to prioritize fixing the economies and actually developing them. I think the Western homogeny is the most particularly problematic one when it comes to dollar imperialism. They didn't even say anything in regards to that. Onto the most clinical and most important one is in regards to how Donald Trump and his emergence is going to affect people. I think they just give up on this particular argument. Their best response boils down to, look, Donald Trump is really not taking advantage of these particular structures. Panel, they're lying. Panel, from what I remember, saying a team is lying is not really how you're going to win a debate. We give you loads of reasons as to why this is true. 2/3 of the majority given to the USA in respect to decision making. I don't care if they are allies. They're still most probably affecting them, especially with Donald Trump having the bargaining chip when it comes to how much money is spent to that particular organization. These people are at the will of USA and all of its militaristic intent. You don't change that particular structure the moment in which you forfeit your sovereignty of that particular organization and do ludicrous things such as the Arab Spring, where you killed thousands of people. In all respects, panel, we win this debate by proving exclusivity on our side of the house. Thank you for the ballot. 4th time in a row. Very proud to propose.
Okay, thank you, Prop Reply, for concluding what was a very interesting and exciting debate. Can my other panelists and I just join the op prep room for room 1 so that we're able to deliberate? But thank you everyone for the debate. Debaters, you can congratulate yourselves for what was a really exciting debate. Panelists, let's meet in op prep for room 1.
Thanks for the debate.
Okay, hey everyone, I'm back again. As judges are moving to the other room for their own deliberation. Wait, Joseph, I hope the live stream is off now. I don't know if you want to continue, but it's still okay anyways. So we will just proceed to the closing ceremony. That way we don't have to wait for the judges to be back. Okay, so a couple of things that you're gonna do. Can we keep our microphones muted as well? So this has been a very good tournament. Obviously my slides have been messed up. It's kind of full. I don't know if you guys can read that. But I would just like to do